In 1212, a single spark inside a London timber house ignited a firestorm that consumed the city. 3,000 people burned to death in a matter of hours. The flames raced across thatched roofs and pitch-covered walls as the city turned into a furnace. Panic choked the narrow streets as the fire trapped thousands against the stone walls of London Bridge. It was the deadliest inferno in the history of medieval England. But to understand why this disaster happened, you need to see the open hearth that sat at the center of every home. The fire that claimed those 3,000 lives began in the most mundane way possible. It started with a cooking fire that simply grew too large for the room. In the early 13th century, London was a city built almost entirely of wood and dried straw. Houses were packed so tightly together that a fire in one kitchen easily leapt to the next. The inhabitants relied on open hearths located in the middle of their living spaces. These hearths provided the only heat for cooking and for surviving the damp English winters. There were no stone chimneys to draw the smoke and sparks up into the sky. Instead, the smoke drifted toward a simple hole in the roof. When the fire flared, sparks rose directly into the dry thatch above. The dry reeds acted like a fuse for the entire structure. The 1212 disaster forced the authorities to confront the lethal reality of their architecture. The aftermath of the tragedy left the city streets covered in ash and debris. King John and the city leaders issued the assize of buildings in response to the carnage. This was the first time the government mandated structural changes to save lives. They outlawed the use of flammable thatch for roofing in the city center. New building codes required the use of stone walls to act as fire breaks between homes. Slate and tile became the new standard for roofs to prevent embers from taking hold. It was a desperate shift in policy, born from the stench of thousands of bodies. London had learned that their daily routine of open-flame cooking was a slow-motion catastrophe. The city began the long process of replacing timber with stone to ensure that the streets would not burn again. The story of domestic fire began long before city streets burned. It started in the Fertile Crescent around 7100 BCE. Archaeologists found the evidence in the ruins of Çatalhöyük. This settlement in modern-day Turkey housed thousands of people in mud brick homes. The structures were packed so tightly that residents walked across flat rooftops. These roofs served as the primary entrance for every household. But to understand why these homes survived, you need to see the smoke hole. Each room featured a single opening cut directly into the ceiling. This hole served as both a window for light and a chimney for smoke. The residents positioned their hearths directly beneath this opening. By keeping the fire centered under the hole, they directed smoke straight upward. This simple alignment prevented the interior air from becoming unbreathable. But to understand the danger, you need to see the building materials. The homes were constructed from timber beams and sun-dried mud bricks. Exposed wood near a fire was a recipe for structural collapse. The inhabitants managed this risk with specialized floor construction. They layered the ground with hardened clay and lime plaster. These materials acted as a fire-resistant barrier against the heat. Archaeological excavations show that hearths were not permanent fixtures. The residents frequently moved the fire source to different spots on the floor. This constant relocation prevented the heat from charring the supporting timber beams. The people of Çatalhöyük lived in a delicate balance with their heat source. They engineered their entire domestic environment to survive the flame. This was the first human attempt to domesticate fire within a confined space. It was a survival strategy that lasted for thousands of years. But the risk of burning their own roof remained a daily reality. The residents learned to control the fire by limiting its growth. They fed the hearth small amounts of fuel to keep the heat contained. The smoke hole was a masterpiece of early engineering. It proved that the survival of the home depended on the management of the flame. The mud brick walls stood for generations because the fire stayed beneath the hole. This was the documented reality of Neolithic life. Fire was a tool that required constant, careful supervision. The people of Çatalhöyük lived and died by their ability to control that spark. They left behind a blueprint for every home that followed. But to understand how this system evolved, you need to see the Roman stone platforms. The Roman Empire recognized the danger of the open hearth long before the medieval era. Archaeologists excavating the ruins of Pompeii and Herculaneum uncovered the physical evidence of this shift. The Romans moved their fires out of the main living quarters. They constructed dedicated cooking rooms known as the culinæ. In these small, narrow spaces, the heat was confined to a stone platform called a foculus. These platforms were built against the interior walls of the house. Workers filled the interior of these masonry structures with rubble or ash. A layer of ceramic tiles capped the top of the platform. This design created a vital thermal barrier between the fire and the wooden floor beams. The wood beneath the cooking area remained cool, even when the charcoal burned bright. It was a deliberate feat of engineering, meant to stop the city from turning into ash. But to understand the scale of the threat, you need to see the density of Roman urban centers. Augustus Caesar, the first Roman emperor, understood that fire was the primary enemy of his capital. In 6 CE, he established the Vigiles Urbani to patrol the winding streets. This was a specialized force of 7,000 men, organized specifically for firefighting. They operated with the authority of the state to douse flames before they consumed the city. The members of this force carried buckets, sponges, and hooks to dismantle burning structures. They monitored the cooking platforms in every apartment block. The reality was that Roman life centered on high-density housing built from wood and sun-dried brick. A single neglected foculus could ignite an entire city block in minutes. The Vigiles Urbani spent their nights watching the smoke rise above the rooftops. They stood as the final line of defense against the volatility of the charcoal fire. The Roman approach transformed cooking from a communal living room activity into a technical, isolated task. It was the first time in history that a government mandated fire suppression as a public service. Yet the risk remained embedded in the materials of the Roman world. Excavations reveal that even with these masonry platforms, heat remained a constant destructive force. The charred remains of timber beams found near these kitchens tell the story of frequent, localized disasters. The Romans built their infrastructure to manage the flame, but they could never fully extinguish the danger. Their reliance on charcoal meant that the fire was always present, waiting for a lapse in supervision. The legacy of the Roman culinae proved that engineering could delay the inferno. It could not, however, eliminate the lethal intersection of fire and timber. The struggle to keep the heat within the stone was the defining challenge of the ancient city. The sprawling city of Rome was a tinderbox of sun-dried brick and timber. In 6 CE, the risk of total incineration defined the life of every citizen. Augustus Caesar, the first Roman emperor, recognized that his capital lived on the edge of ruin. He established the Vigiles Urbani to confront the constant threat of urban conflagration. This was a specialized force of 7,000 men organized under the direct authority of the state. Their primary mission was the immediate suppression of any flame that threatened the city. The members of this force patrolled the narrow, winding streets of Rome every night. They carried buckets, sponges, and heavy iron hooks through the crowded apartment blocks. Their authority allowed them to inspect the cooking platforms inside any private residence. The reality was that Roman life relied on high-density housing built from wood and brick. A single neglected foculus could ignite an entire city block in mere minutes. The Vigiles Urbani spent their nights watching for smoke rising above the rooftops. They stood as the final desperate line of defense against the volatility of the charcoal fire. Each man was trained to dismantle burning structures before the flames could jump to the next building. The Roman approach transformed cooking from a casual domestic chore into a highly monitored technical task. This was the first time in history that a government mandated fire suppression as a public service. Yet the risk remained deeply embedded in the flammable materials of the Roman world. Archaeological excavations reveal that even with these masonry platforms, heat remained a constant destructive force. The charred remains of timber beams found near these kitchens tell the story of frequent, localized disasters. The Romans built their infrastructure to manage the flame, but they could never fully extinguish the danger. Their reliance on charcoal meant that the fire was always present, waiting for a single lapse in supervision. The legacy of the Vigiles Urbani proved that state-level engineering could delay an inevitable inferno. It could not, however, eliminate the lethal intersection of open flame and urban wood. The struggle to keep the heat within the stone was the defining challenge of the ancient city. But to understand why this fight became so desperate, you need to see the architecture of the Roman apartment block. The insulae were multi-story buildings that packed hundreds of people into cramped quarters. These structures lacked modern fire exits and relied on interior stairwells that acted as chimneys for smoke. If a kitchen fire started on the ground floor, the entire building became a furnace within moments. The vigiles urbani faced an impossible task when the wind caught the flames in these dense neighborhoods. They fought the fires with manual pumps, but the water supply in many Roman districts was limited. The fire remained a persistent, deadly neighbor in every Roman home. The state-mandated patrols were the only thing preventing the city from burning to the ground every season. It was a cycle of constant vigilance that defined the Roman experience for centuries. The cold winds swept across the northern European plains during the Middle Centuries. Families huddled inside the timber-framed structures known as hall houses. The center of every home remained the stone hearth. Smoke rose directly from the fire into the high rafters of the main hall. Residents installed a wooden structure called a louvre above the central hearth. The louvre functioned as a slatted opening in the peaked roof. It allowed the heavy gray smoke to escape into the winter sky. This ventilation system was the primary method for managing indoor air quality. The fire burned on a raised circle of stone in the middle of the floor. Sparks frequently jumped from the crackling logs toward the dry timber walls. The entire ceiling remained coated in thick, black soot from years of constant use. Archaeological records show these halls were designed around the central fire. The layout dictated that all domestic life occurred within the reach of the heat. But to understand the danger, you need to see the architecture of the roof. The wooden beams rested directly beneath the path of the rising heat. Dry thatch covered the exterior, creating a constant risk of total ignition. The louvre served as the only exit for the fire's byproducts. If the wind shifted, the smoke surged back down into the living space. People sat on benches placed at the perimeter of the room to avoid the worst fumes. The fire dictated the movement of every person within the hall. It was a primitive, high-risk arrangement that persisted for hundreds of years. The reality was that the central stone hearth provided no physical barrier to the home. The open flame remained exposed to the surrounding wooden posts and furniture. Every night, the family relied on the louvre to clear the air before sleep. They watched the flickering light dance against the dark, soot-stained timber. The hall house was a fragile ecosystem built of wood, stone, and open fire. It worked only as long as the flames remained contained on the stone floor. Any collapse of a burning log signaled a threat to the entire structure. The medieval home was a constant, deliberate exercise in fire management. History proved that the louvre was a necessary, yet insufficient, safety measure. The danger of the open hearth defined the limits of medieval domestic life. The stone walls of the 14th century hall house absorbed heat until they cracked. Each evening fire acted like a slow-motion battering ram against the masonry. Builders noticed the mortar crumbling behind the hearths. They looked for a way to shield the structural integrity of the home. The solution appeared in the form of the iron fireback. Workers cast heavy slabs of iron to place against the rear wall. These plates acted as a physical barrier between the flame and the building. The iron absorbed the intense heat instead of the stone. It reflected the warmth back into the center of the hall. This simple metal slab changed the thermal physics of the home. The stone walls remained cool enough to prevent mortar failure. Families could build larger fires without fear of a wall collapse. Archaeological digs across Europe show the soot patterns changed after this shift. The fireback became a standard feature in wealthy households. It marked the transition toward intentional heat management. But to understand why this mattered, you need to see the cost of past failures. The Assize of Buildings had already attempted to regulate construction in 1212. It followed a fire that consumed London and killed 3,000 people. The authorities realized that wood and thatch were death traps. They mandated stone walls to stop the spread of house fires. The fireback served as the next evolution of this safety mandate. It protected the very walls the laws required builders to construct. The iron plate became a symbol of fire-conscious domestic engineering. It reduced the frequency of repairs needed after every winter. The rear wall no longer succumbed to the steady erosion of heat. Still, the fire remained exposed to the open air of the room. Sparks could jump over the iron plate with ease. The fireback protected the architecture, but not the inhabitants. It stood as a silent, heavy witness to the constant struggle for safety. The medieval home was a battleground of controlled combustion. Every night, the fireback glowed red in the dim light of the hall. It held the weight of the flame away from the structure. The technology proved that safety required physical intervention, not just caution. Historians found these plates in the ruins of manor houses across England. Each one showed the heavy toll of decades of fire. The iron warped under the pressure of the heat. It protected the stone, but the iron itself eventually failed. The fireback was a necessary yet temporary defensive layer. It bought the residents time, but the danger never truly retreated. The central hearth eventually migrated toward the perimeter of the room. Builders carved deep recesses into the stone chimney breasts. They called these architectural features inglenooks. The fire sat tucked away from the path of the household. This shift isolated the flames from the main living space. The risk of accidental contact dropped significantly with this change. But to understand why this movement mattered, you need to see the simple mechanics of the iron crane. Cooks previously struggled with heavy iron pots over open flames. They reached directly over the heat to stir or serve. Spills were common and frequently ignited the surrounding floor. The iron crane arrived as a structural solution to human error. It was a sturdy, swinging arm mounted inside the inglenook. The device allowed the cook to move heavy vessels away from the fire. One motion pulled the pot into the cool air of the room. The iron trammel hung from the crane to hold the weight. It featured adjustable hooks for precise height control. The cook no longer stood directly inside the smoke. The danger of accidental flare-ups declined as the pot moved away. Every meal required less physical proximity to the open flame. The iron crane transformed the kitchen into a zone of controlled labor. Archaeological records show these iron fixtures became standard by the 16th century. They appeared in manor houses and cottages across England and France. The metal hardware replaced the precarious rope or chain systems of the past. The crane held the weight of boiling water and heavy stew. Accidents involving spilled boiling liquid became less frequent in the hearth area. The inglenook provided a secondary layer of fire containment. The stone walls of the recess shielded the timber frame of the house. Sparks stayed trapped within the masonry instead of drifting into the hall. The iron crane worked in tandem with this new architecture. The fire remained contained while the cook stayed safe at a distance. This transition represented a major leap in domestic safety. The era of the centralized, exposed fire was ending. Safety became a matter of mechanical design rather than constant vigilance. The iron crane stood as a quiet, heavy witness to this evolution. Each forged link in the trammel held the history of a safer home. The reality was that the hearth had finally been tamed by iron. The fire no longer dominated the geography of the room. It retreated into the wall to serve the needs of the household. The inglenook became the foundation for all future kitchen design. The iron crane proved that human error could be managed through simple physics. The fireplace was no longer a wild element within the home. It was a tool, constrained by stone and iron, serving a purpose. The danger of the open flame remained, but it was finally manageable. Families could sleep with more security than their ancestors had known. The age of the inglenook signaled the end of the reckless hearth. The transition saved countless homes from the threat of sudden ignition. Safety was now built into the very walls of the residence. The date was September 2, 1666. The location was Pudding Lane in London. Thomas Farriner operated a bakery on this narrow, timber-framed street. His hearth contained the embers of a fire used to bake the day's bread. The surrounding walls were constructed of wood and covered in flammable pitch. Dry summer weather had turned the city into a tinderbox. A spark escaped the hearth during the early morning hours. The heat ignited nearby piles of flour sacks and wooden crates. Thomas Farriner and his family fled the building as flames climbed the walls. The fire spread rapidly to the neighboring timber structures. London was a city built of wood, thatch, and tar. The open hearths of the city provided the ignition source for the disaster. Strong winds pushed the flames across the dense urban landscape. The fire consumed the warehouse district along the Thames riverbank. It destroyed the medieval heart of the city over 4 days. Historians documented that the fire leveled thousands of homes. The Great Fire of London exposed the lethal flaw of open-flame cooking. The proximity of hearths to timber frames rendered the city defenseless. The fire eventually claimed the medieval St. Paul's Cathedral. Smoke choked the streets as residents retreated toward the river. Official records later confirmed the bakery hearth as the point of origin. The catastrophe forced a permanent shift in how Londoners managed fire. The authorities moved to ban thatch roofs and timber-heavy construction. They mandated brick and stone for all future residential walls. The event proved that open hearths were incompatible with high-density living. The disaster became a turning point for urban fire safety regulations. The city rebuilt itself with wider streets and masonry materials. The era of the reckless, exposed hearth reached a violent conclusion. The tragedy of 1666 remained the standard for fire risk assessment. Safety became a requirement of law rather than a matter of caution. The year was 1696 in London. A group of property owners established the Hand-in-Hand Fire and Life Insurance Society. The city remained scarred by the ruins of the 1666 conflagration. Insurance companies viewed the typical residential hearth as a financial liability. The underwriters analyzed thousands of fire claims from across the city. They discovered a pattern of heat transfer through wooden floor joists. The data proved that proximity caused disaster. A hearth built directly against a timber frame acted as a slow-burning fuse. The society implemented a revolutionary requirement for new policyholders. They mandated a mandatory setback of 6 to 12 inches between the masonry hearth and any wooden joists. This rule became the first true building code for fire prevention. The physical documents of the Hand-in-Hand Society recorded these structural failures. Inspectors walked through timber-framed houses to verify the new masonry gaps. They measured the distance from the stone floor to the nearest structural beam. If the gap fell short, the owner faced a higher premium or total denial of coverage. The market dictated safety, where the law previously failed to intervene. Builders began to isolate the hearth from the skeleton of the house. The 6-inch gap created a thermal buffer that saved thousands of homes. But to understand why this administrative change mattered, you need to see the cost of the alternative. Each claim filed with the society represented a life interrupted by fire. The archives of the Hand-in-Hand Society detail the shift from reckless construction to cautious engineering. The fire risk was no longer an act of God. It was an engineering problem with an economic solution. The insurance industry essentially forced the evolution of the modern home. They treated the fireplace as a machine that required specific safety tolerances. The days of the exposed, timber-adjacent hearth were officially over. Londoners began to see their homes as systems of interconnected parts. The masonry hearth became a distinct, protected island within the floor plan. This was the birth of modern fire regulation. Insurance records provided the evidence that changed how architects designed residential spaces. The 1696 mandate influenced building practices for the next 2 centuries. The threat of financial ruin forced builders to respect the physics of heat. The iron crane and the masonry setback worked together to secure the hearth. Fire was finally treated as a contained energy source. The era of the uncontrolled domestic fire drew to a close. The Hand-in-Hand Society proved that safety was a calculated investment. The 1790s marked the final transformation of the domestic hearth. Benjamin Thompson, known as Count Rumford, turned his attention to the kitchen. He applied the principles of thermodynamics to the design of the cooking range. Traditional hearths wasted nearly 90% of their fuel as heat escaped up the flue. Benjamin Thompson identified this inefficiency as a source of extreme danger. He engineered a cast iron enclosure to contain the fire within a restricted chamber. The design utilized a series of controlled flues to direct heat onto the cooking pots. This innovation isolated the flame from the living environment for the first time. The heat was captured and channeled rather than left to radiate into the timber walls. The iron range acted as a barrier between the fire and the home's structure. No longer did a cook have to lean over an open, flickering blaze to boil water. The risk of accidental ignition dropped significantly with the flame safely trapped inside iron. Kitchens transitioned from chaotic workshops to organized, contained spaces of utility. The era of the reckless, exposed hearth reached its definitive end. Benjamin Thompson's range established the blueprint for the modern kitchen stove. Fire was finally treated as a contained energy source rather than an unpredictable guest. The safety measures of the insurance societies and the engineering of the physicist converged. Homes became systems of protection against the very element that sustained them. You have spent this entire time thinking that the fire in your own home is under control. But every time you walk away from your stove or click off a light, you are just betting your life on a thin, invisible line of safety. You are living inside the same cycle that started with a spark in a bakery on Pudding Lane. History didn't leave those fires in the past. It just taught them how to wait for you.